The Wings of Florith, Book 1, The Duke's Son, Part 2, The Exile, Chapter 26, The Gates of Gol-spon. Reyes was all alone in the world. It had been quite the hectic night, and it was only just beginning to occur to him, as he crossed the border of Elistrade, that he was on his own now. His family had put themselves at great risk to save him. He loved his family. He was already missing them. Now there was no one he could turn to for help or comfort. He had to make his own way in a land that he had spent most of his life thinking of as evil, and somehow find a way to survive. Not for the first time in his life, he felt both the need and the inability to cry. The land just beyond the border was beautiful. It would make fine farmland for anyone willing to own a farm on it. It was the same on the Florith side. The land looked ideal for growing crops, but no one wanted to be in easy striking range of the border, and so it had been left to fend for itself. Reyes rode on north. He had only a rough idea of where the City of Golespon was, but it was such a large city that he was pretty sure he wouldn't be able to miss it. Besides, even if he did somehow skirt around the city, he expected to find roads that would aid him in finding it. Reyes had been on the go all night. He felt safer now that he was across the border, and the adrenaline rush caused by his life being in immediate danger was beginning to fade. He was beginning to feel very tired. He rode on until he was certain he could no longer be seen from the human side of the border. Then he dismounted from the horse, tied its reins to a nearby tree, and settled down in the long grass for a short nap. It was cold. The grass was slightly damp with the dew of the new day, and there was something of an icy chill about the very air. Reyes wished he had a blanket. He wished he was back in the comfort of his own bed. Maybe this was all a dream. It was one of those Harpy dreams he had had so often in his youth. He was going to wake up at any moment and find himself at home in his own bed, and he would be human. Surprisingly, Reyes didn't fall asleep immediately. His thoughts slowly drifted over the fact that it was now gone time for his execution. They must have realised that he wasn't in his cell by now. He hoped his father was all right. Mangloss had been going to teach him a scrying spell soon. He wished he had already learnt it, so he could use it to watch what was happening at the castle. Reyes finally fell asleep. He slept well. His dreams were filled with images of his sister and Prince Goti. They were getting married, and Reyes was there in the great hall of the palace, as he imagined it would be. There was someone else with him. It was his father. The Duke hadn't been executed after all. Something shot Reyes awake. Something that didn't belong. It was almost as if someone had whispered in his ear. He wasn't too sure what had woken him, or even how long he had been asleep, only that as he woke, he had a bit of a headache. Nearby, Reyes could hear voices. Maybe that was what had woken him. They were quite faint, even to his superior hearing. Reyes listened carefully. He thought he recognized the language. It sounded suspiciously like Harpy. The voices were coming from somewhere above him. They seemed to be circling slowly overhead and slowly descending. Reyes stayed where he was, hardly daring to move. With any luck they hadn't seen him, covered as he was by the long grass. He hoped it was just a coincidence that they were about to land nearby. Then he realised that his horse wasn't all that well covered. I tell you, there's a horse down there. It'll save us from having to look any further. There's someone already with the horse. Could be another Huntress. There are 4 of us, and only one of her. Let's take it from her. Reyes couldn't make out what they were actually saying. He saw them fly directly over him and land just a few feet away. He had counted 4 of them, but they had been going at such speed that he couldn't be too sure he had counted accurately. His mind was in conflict. Part of him insisted that he should steer clear of them. They were Harpies, and they were dangerous. The other part tried to assure him that since he too was a Harpy, he had nothing to fear from them. Then again, he still hadn't really come to terms with the fact that he was a Harpy. Slowly, he raised his head above the level of the grass, so he could see them. There were indeed 4 Harpies standing no more than 20 yards from where he lay. 3 of them were armed with dart throwers, their darts stored on bandolier-like armbands. The 4th seemed to have no ranged weapon of any kind. They were watching the area where Reyes was lying, and he was certain they must have seen him. He ducked his head down quickly. Had they seen him? He had a nasty feeling that they had. "Hello," one of the 4 said. "Is that your horse?" "Are you sure someone's there?" a second Harpy spoke. "She was looking at us a moment ago," the first replied. Reyes glanced up again, unsure what they were saying. He saw all 4 of them looking right at him. They obviously knew he was there, and it was just as obvious that they were talking to him. Reyes couldn't help but smile. Harpies were such beautiful creatures. If only they weren't so evil. "Hello," one of the Harpies repeated. "You seem to be out here alone. That's a good catch if this is your rite of passage. We could use the meat for our village. Why don't we take you back with us, and you can join our village as a fully fledged huntress? We'll give you full credit for the kill." She was speaking so fast that Reyes could only understand about 1 word in 10. Not that he cared. He couldn't help but admire the beauty of the Harpy that had spoken. Her face was so cute, so lovely. Her body was totally naked, except for a belt similar in style to the one he was wearing. He found his eyes drifting to parts of her body that they had no right examining. Then he looked at each of the other 3 in turn, studying the curves of their naked bodies. His own body began to react in a strange way. There was a tingling about his loins that actually scared him a little. Of the 4 Harpies, only one of them was wearing any kind of skirt. It was one of those skirts with the 6 long, thin pockets. Only this Harpy seemed to be using those pockets to carry a wide array of wicked-looking butcher's knives. The knives fit the pockets so perfectly that Reyes began to suspect that that was exactly what they were for. "Hello," the Harpy said again. "Fish eggs," Reyes replied nervously. "Fish eggs?" The Harpy who had greeted Reyes looked more than slightly puzzled. Hello." Reyes screamed at himself inwardly. He had mistakenly put the emphasis on the wrong part of the word, and by doing so had altered its entire meaning. "She's male," the Harpy with the belt declared. "That was a male voice." "Indeed," agreed a second Harpy. "This changes the whole game," commented the one with the skirt. "What shall we do with her?" This 4th Harpy appeared to be younger than any of the other 3, though she was still a lot older than Reyes. When she spoke to the others, it was with respect in her voice, as if she was unsure she even had a right to her own opinion. "We should kill her," said the one with the skirt. "Our chief won't be happy with us if she ever found out that we let a rival live." "Is she alone?" asked the second. "If she's not alone, we should leave her be. Only, if she has no protectors, should we kill her? We can't risk starting a war with another village." "She's alone," confirmed the one with the belt. "We saw no one else even close." "What's she doing out here anyway?" asked the youngest. "That much is obvious. She's hunting. With no females to hunt for her, she's having to fend for herself," commented the one in the skirt. "Personally," the youngest stated, "I'd like to make use of her before we kill her." "Make use of her?" asked the one with the belt. "You know what I mean," the youngest replied, giggling. "I passed my rite of passage 2 years ago, and I'm still waiting to be sent to the chief." "That might be fun," the second agreed, "but if the chief were ever to find out, your life wouldn't be worth a dull pebble." Reyes lay there watching each as she spoke, wishing he understood more than the little he did. If he was honest with himself, it didn't really sound as if they had his best interests at heart. If there was going to be any sort of trouble, he felt he would be able to cope with it better if he climbed to his feet. Somehow, as Reyes stood up, he didn't feel quite as self-conscious in front of these 4 strange Harpies as he had in front of his own family. He was getting used to the idea of being naked. Perhaps it was because the girl was standing in front of him didn't seem to care about their own nudity. Although deep in conversation, the youngest of the Harpies turned to look at him. Then she began to giggle again. Wondering what had caught her companion's eye, the harpy in the skirt also turned her head to look at Reyes. It's certainly been a long time since I had that effect on a male. What makes you think she was admiring you? This came from the youngest. That is a nice sword, said the harpy with the belt. She had also turned her head now, looking to see what had so amused the other two. The other harpies started to giggle again. I just think it would make a nice addition to our chief's collection, the one with the belt tried to explain. Which sword? The harpy in the skirt replied. She started laughing again. The harpy with the belt sighed. Come on, let's kill her quickly, then we can take the horse for dinner and go home. Easiest hunt I've ever been on, commented the one in the skirt. Up until now, Reyes had had no real clue as to the intentions of the 4 huntresses. He had been afraid to even touch his bow lest it seemed like a hostile move. Now though, the 4 harpies made their intent only too clear. The 3 that were carrying dart throwers began to load them, each taking a single dart from their armband bandoliers and readying them for firing. Realizing his danger, Reyes quickly grabbed his bow, knocked an arrow, and fired. The dart thrower is a lighter, easy to carry weapon, but the bow is faster to load, so Reyes was just able to get his shot off first. Thanks to help from his bracelets, Reyes' arrow went straight through the neck of the belted harpy. For a moment she looked quite shocked by the outcome of the battle, but then her eyes glazed over, and she fell backwards onto the soft long grass behind her. The 2 remaining armed harpies were so shocked by the sudden death of one of their number that they fired wide. Reyes quickly knocked a second arrow to his bow and took careful aim. Even though the bracelets meant he couldn't miss, he still felt the need to aim. Come on, said the youngest. She was flapping her wings quickly and slowly leaving the ground behind. I think there must be something easier to hunt elsewhere. I think so too, replied the harpy in the skirt, and she too launched herself into the air. Shame about Shearman, said the last one as she followed the others. Pah, commented the one in the skirt. I never liked her anyway. Reyes watched them for a minute, his bow at the ready, just to make sure they were really leaving, and not just trying to gain some height advantage on him, or outflank him in some way. Once he was sure they were gone, Reyes allowed himself to drop his guard, and returned the arrow to his quiver. He walked slowly over to the body of the dead harpy, feelings of guilt welling up in his throat. She was still so beautiful as she lay there. Reyes tried not to dwell on the loveliness of her body. Falling in love with a harpy might not have been all that perverted after all, but staring at the body of a naked dead female had to be, regardless of what species she was. Reyes undid the belt from the harpy and checked the pouches. There was a small collection of pretty stones in one of the pouches, but none of them had any real value. Reyes put them back in the pouch and laid the belt across her body. Part of him wanted to bury her, but he had nothing to dig with, and he was still feeling far too tired to even try. He left the body where it lay and returned to where he had tethered the horse. Part of him wanted to go back to sleep for an hour or two, but after that little skirmish, he was feeling so on edge that he wasn't sure he'd be able to sleep again any time soon. Besides, the sun was quite high above the horizon already, and he felt it would be nice to reach Gol-spon before lunchtime. He had already finished off the food that had been given to him last night. Reyes didn't have to ride too long before he caught sight of the city on the horizon. Gol-spon was more than 100 times larger than Lamington. It was the largest city in Elestrade. It had been said that it was further from the north gates to the southern gates of the city than it was to the southern gates across the border to Castle Demoth. It was common knowledge, even in Floreth, that the southern gates of Gol-spon were always kept closed. Those gates were too close to the border and only served as a sally port if the city should be attacked. Reyes would need to find another way into the city. If the teachings of his father were right, there should be 6 other entrances into the city. Of them, the southeastern gate would be the easiest for Reyes to get to from his current position. It was only about 1.5 miles along the wall from the southern gate. Less than 2 minutes later, Reyes found himself on one of the major roads that would take him into the city. It was relatively busy, with lots of people heading both to and from the city. Reyes began to follow the road, He had only been travelling at a gentle gait for a minute or two when he overheard a couple of elven farmers that passed him the other way. "Look! A harpy on a horse! You don't see that every day." Although his Elvish wasn't that good, Reyes managed to catch the gist of what they had said. He dismounted from his horse and began to lead it by the reins. He didn't want to stand out any more than he had to. It was already bad enough that he was male and would stand out anyway. First opportunity he got, he was going to have to get a skirt. Part of the road, less than a mile short of the city, was being worked on. There was quite a selection of races hard at work, including goblins, humans, minotaurs, ogres, and even a couple of harpies. All were covered by the dust of the road, and they wore chains that marked them as slaves. Looking around, Reyes could see no sign of any soldiers watching over them. No one was there to stop the slaves from escaping. Yes, they bore chains, but they weren't actually chained to anything except each other, and even then, they only seemed to be chained in pairs. Assuming the humans had originally been natives of Florif, Reyes tried to call one of them over. "You there!" The human he called looked up and smiled at Reyes. Then he returned to work, ignoring him. Reyes walked up to the human. "Why don't you escape? The border with Florif is only about 2 miles to the south." "What?" the slave replied. Reyes felt there was something odd about his eyes. "I couldn't do that. It would upset the masters." "The masters?" Reyes asked. But he got nothing more out of the slave. Reyes could understand why the non-humans wouldn't want to cross the border. Florif wasn't exactly hospitable to those who weren't human. But for what reason did the humans stay? Reyes decided to try a second human. "The border with Florif is less than 2 miles away. Why don't you try to escape?" "I have a lot of work to do," the man replied. "But maybe, once the work is done, if our elven masters agree I can go, then I'll leave." "If your elven masters agree," Reyes said, exasperated. He then had to hold his tongue as a pair of elves walked by, using the road. He then said, "It's the elves that have made you into a slave in the first place." "Everyone should know their place," the human responded. "I'm happy to be a slave." "Happy?" Reyes questioned. "Why are you happy to be a slave?" "The masters have told me I'm happy, so I must be happy. Now please, I have much work to do." Reyes felt himself shiver, and he knew it wasn't just because of the cold air. The elves had done something to these people that made them want to work on the road. There was no point in further trying to convince these slaves to escape. There was a queue to get into the city. It was a long queue, maybe half a mile from the actual gate to the end when Reyes joined it. There seemed to be no real order to the queue, just a lot of people, mainly elves, all pushing to get to the front. Reyes felt a little like a punching bag as he was jostled from side to side. On more than one occasion his wings were caught by someone jostling him, and there was at least one incident of someone stepping on the hallux of his left foot. Reyes was sure they hadn't done it on purpose, but he was beginning to wish that he could just fly into the city like any other harpy. The sense of smell of a harpy was by no means anything remarkable, but there was a stench coming from that city, even from this distance, that put the Castle de Moth cesspit to shame. None of the others in the queue with him seemed to even notice the smell. It was as if they were used to it. Gol-spon stank, and unless Reyes was mistaken, it was the stench of rotting flesh. There were guards on the gates, lots of guards. Reyes counted no fewer than 12 guards actually manning the approaches to the southeastern gate, and that number didn't include those that were standing guard on the battlements above and around the gate. Nor did it include those who might be stationed in the 3 official-looking buildings that were located just inside the gate. The guards were stopping everyone who wanted to enter the city. They seemed to be asking questions and demanding a toll. Reyes checked the pouch containing the 2 silver coins that Tyr had given him last night. He hoped the cost wasn't too high. He'd rather not spend an entire coin, but he had to get into the city regardless of how high the price. Eventually, Reyes reached the gates of the city. For a fleeting moment he thought he saw a glimpse of something blue, a magical glow hovering just above the gatehouse out of the corner of his eye. Whatever it was seemed to vanish as Reyes turned his head to look at it, and for a moment he wondered if he had truly seen anything, or if it was merely a figment of his tired imagination. Still pondering what had caused the glow, Reyes was beckoned into the city. "What is your purpose for entering Gol-spon?" The guard asking the question spoke in crisp Elestran Elvish. At least he seemed to be amicable enough. After 4 years of Elestran lessons, Reyes still had trouble understanding what the elves were saying. It didn't help that the elves spoke so quickly that there seemed to be no gaps between their words. Unsure what he should say, he just came out with, friend. The guard didn't seem impressed. He did seem to cotton on to the fact that the Harpy standing before him didn't speak Elvish all that well. He spoke slower and slightly louder. Yes, friend. Why are you here? Reyes' nerves hit a crescendo. He tried to pull himself together, gulped twice, and then explained, "Oh, I move here. I live here." "I see," the guard said slowly. "And why didn't you fly into the city? We don't get many Harpies passing through the gates." Reyes looked blankly as he fought his way through the words, and then replied, "Me out on hunt, catch horse. Me not fly carry horse." "That is a fine horse," the guard commented. "It would be a shame for a horse like that to be wasted as a Harpy's dinner." Reyes looked blankly at the guard. He had only understood the word dinner, but couldn't think in what terms the guard was talking. Could the guard be inviting Reyes to join him for dinner? "You want come dinner?" "No," the elf replied tersely. "I don't want to come to dinner. I want to buy your horse." "Buy horse," Reyes repeated. He couldn't help thinking that he must have sounded very confused. Then he seemed to suddenly realize what the guard had said. "Oh, buy the horse. Sure." "You sell me horse," the guard confirmed. He seemed to be slipping into the same voice pattern as Reyes was using. "You use money. Buy food." "I sell," Reyes agreed. "Good." The guard sounded happy that he had gotten through to the Harpy. "You probably need to sell something to be able to afford the toll anyway. I know you Harpies don't tend to carry much in the way of money." Reyes stared at him blankly. "Toll," the guard repeated. "You pay toll. You sell horse, get money, pay toll." "How much is toll?" Reyes asked. 40 Doran, the guard replied. Reyes nodded, but he was feeling lost. How much was a Doran? And what could it buy in relation to an Arcror? How much was the horse worth? How many Doran would one of his silver coins buy? Reyes had a nasty feeling entry into the city was going to cost him heavily. Reyes also began to get a strong suspicion that the guard had boosted the cost of the toll a bit to help offset the cost of the horse. "I'll give you 300 for the horse," the guard offered. Being offered 300 for the horse reminded Reyes too much of the time he had sold a pony for a mere 1500 Arcror. On the other hand, now that Reyes was in the city, he didn't want to be tied down having to lead a horse everywhere. Perhaps this elf would give it a good home. Feeling he should be asking 5 or 6 times the amount, Reyes said 600. The guard seemed unsure. He examined the horse more closely for a few minutes, checking the beast's feet, his mane, and his teeth. Then he said 400. Reyes had expected this. He had already been thinking about his response. 550. The guard nodded and quickly responded with 475. Reyes hesitated. He wanted to say 525, but had forgotten what the other strand for 20 was. 510. 500, the guard came back with almost immediately. "Agreed," Reyes accepted. Certain that he had sold the horse for a tiny fraction of its true value, Reyes handed the reins to the elven guard and received 4 small silver-coloured coins in exchange, each of them valued at 1 Doren. The guard then counted out 60 Doren and also handed those to Reyes. "I took the toll," the guard commented. Reyes looked at the coins he had been handed, uncertain as to what had just happened. Although he felt he had been ripped off, he daren't make too much of a fuss, so he just shrugged his shoulders, put the coins in one of the pouches of his belt, and entered the city.